What's going on, everyone? It's Justin here, and welcome to my review of the Apple iPhone XS and XS Max, Apple's newest flagship offerings for 2018. And today I'm going to talk about my experience with the smartphones. I've been using the iPhone XS Max as my daily driver, and kind of just the things that Apple may have improved, things that they could have done better, and at the end of the day, whether it's worth the money or upgradable from previous generations. I'm also giving away an iPhone XS on the channel, so if you guys want to enter, make sure you check the link down below. But the typical, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, drop a like on this video, and also leave a comment down below, and follow me on my Instagram and Twitter, as that's where I'm going to be announcing the winner. So I think a lot of this video is going to be focused towards the iPhone XS Max because it is the new size for this year. I think it's what everyone's been very excited about because with the initial release of the iPhone X, Apple kept the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, and this is the first year where their large phone doesn't have a home button. The screen covers the entire phone, and it's the largest screen that Apple has ever put in a smartphone. I think, as you guys might know, Apple likes to wait a long time to introduce certain things to their smartphones. Things that you might have seen on Android devices or around the industry that we had to wait a long time for. We finally got wireless charging last year, but I think this year there really isn't any feature of this device that lets you say, finally, Apple gave this to us after waiting so many years. I think that's kind of the common trend here with software and hardware. With iOS 12, it's been very focused on optimization, and with this device, with the exception to the new size, there are some small tune-ups here and there, but nothing groundbreaking or major. I'm just going to warn you about that. As someone who used the iPhone 7 Plus and then switched to the iPhone X last year, I think the iPhone XS is the perfect size, but something about me really enjoys the size of the iPhone XS Max, with exception to it not being as easy to use one-handed, which is something that I actually find myself doing a lot. On the inside, you're going to find the typical spec bumps with Apple's A12 processor, as well as 4 gigs of RAM up from 3. The phone is also ever so slightly thicker at 7.7mm, with a small increase in size in the camera bump as well, but I think that's for good reason, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. This phone also has supposedly the most durable glass that Apple has ever put on a smartphone on the front and back, and although they say that every single year, I was actually a little bit curious because I noticed that my iPhone X, despite having a case, scratched very easily on the front especially. If you guys go ahead and check out Jerry Rig Everything's test though, he stated that there isn't really improvement in terms of scratch resistant on the new models.
This new iPhone screen will scratch just as easy as your last iPhone.
So if you guys want to protect your phone from scratches or want to give it a new look or something, you can go ahead and check out Dbrand, and the Black Matrix is a skin that I'm a huge fan of, especially with the gold trim, because I'm not the biggest fan of the gold on the back of these devices. So I'll be leaving a link to that down below. Speaking of the color though, the gold is kind of a new introduction this year. As you guys might know, Apple introduced the black and the white for the iPhone X last year, and honestly, I kind of have a mixed feeling of the new gold color. I think going with a black or white's a little bit safer, but if you want that gold trim, then I don't think it looks that bad. I just think for me, using a phone that has kind of this pink shade going with stuff that I wear and everything else that I have just doesn't really go as well. I think above all else though, the biggest improvements this year came in the camera, and that is always a good thing because I take a ton of photos on my phone. I think I have like 9,000 photos accumulated from previous generations. So the camera on a phone is very important to me because I don't normally like to take around all of the gear when it comes to production and photo, especially when I'm traveling. I also have a dedicated video talking about the camera improvements with my friend and photographer on Instagram, Sam Elkins. So if you guys want to check that out, I'm going to leave a link down below. I definitely recommend you go ahead and watch that. But at the event, Apple just really seemed to emphasize computational improvements on the back end, the neural engine thanks to the A12 processor, which is great, but it had me a little bit disappointed initially, thinking that there wasn't many hardware upgrades. This year, the sensor size is actually 32% larger on the wide angle camera, which is actually huge. It lets in a lot more light. The pixel sizes are also larger. As a result of this, the hump on the back of the phone is also slightly larger, but I honestly don't really care that much anymore. And the telephoto lens is the same as before, stabilized with a 12 megapixel resolution as well. The iPhone X obviously already had a pretty decent camera, but when you compare it to the iPhone XS, what I noticed was more dynamic range. I know a lot of people on Twitter were saying like, oh, you could fix that in post, but dynamic range obviously just captures more information in the image, in the shadows and the highlight, and I actually noticed a pretty good difference. And as someone who likes to edit a lot of their photos in VSCO and in Lightroom on the phone, I think that does help a lot. When it comes to DSLRs and professional cameras, something that a lot of people always focus on is the amount of dynamic range that they can capture. Another big question though is it better than some of the other Android phones on the market at the moment? And I will say, yes and no. If you compare the photos to, for example, the Google Pixel 2, which has kind of been hailed the best camera out there, I think the Google Pixel 2 does have the competitive edge when it comes to just a photo out of camera without any editing. But as someone who edits pretty much every photo that I take and end up posting, I think that the flatter look is something that I personally favor. A lot of the improvements in the camera also come in the smart HDR with faster sensors, enhanced image signal processing, advanced algorithms, dynamic range, and all that. And something Apple spent a lot of time talking about this year is the improvements in portrait mode thanks to the AI learning, because the phones that have the single camera like the iPhone XR also have the ability to do the same portrait photos on the iPhone XS and XS Max. You can also adjust the aperture on this phone for the portrait mode anywhere from f1.4 to f14, and it does look pretty good actually for a phone. It's obviously not going to compare to an expensive DSLR with a lens that is made for great bokeh, but in terms of foreground background separation, it actually did a pretty good job. The front camera on the iPhone XS and XS Max is the same 7 megapixel with f2.2 aperture, and I think Apple's always done a pretty good job in terms of skin tones on the front-facing camera, but in terms of quality, I feel like 7 megapixels just isn't enough. I would have liked to have seen them do some more improvements to the front-facing camera, but one thing that we do have now is stabilization on the front. So for those who want to use a front-facing camera for video or your Instagram stories, then that's going to be a good improvement. The front-facing camera also does have the true depth portrait mode. When it comes to video, the phone can still of course record in 4K, and once again it looks really good, and I think iPhones have had the best stabilization in smartphones that I've tested out in the past year. Some can argue that the Samsung is more stable when it comes to just being static, but I think in terms of natural movement, and if you're someone who does some phone vlogging and walks around with their camera and points at different things, a lot of the other Android devices that I tested out seem to have kind of a very artificial effect when you move the camera, whereas the iPhone just has a very natural optical stabilization on both cameras, which I love. One new feature that we also have in the rear-facing video camera though is the ability for it to automatically switch the frames per second based on the lighting. If you're recording at 30 frames per second and you're entering an area that might be a little bit darker, the camera will actually adjust on the fly to 24 frames per second to let in more light. The new iPhones also have the ability to record stereo audio in video mode. So when it comes to the camera's pure quality, I think Apple has done a pretty good job in the improvements that they needed to make in terms of dynamic range, and they definitely did more than I actually expected after seeing the keynote. But I wouldn't say Apple has kind of set a new standard or set the bar high for the year of 2018, because the Pixel 3 is coming out in a couple weeks, and I'm very curious to see how that stacks up with the iPhone XS and XS Max. Additionally, the iPhone is also IP68 rated, which is a small improvement from IP67, so instead of being water resistant at up to 1 meter for 30 minutes, it can now withstand 2 meters. So if you decide to drop your phone in a deeper pool than before, it might be okay. But if you're like my friend iSetups and drops his phone in the Blue Lagoon in Iceland and breaks his iPhone 10, you still don't want to completely rely on the water resistant rating, and Apple still does not cover it under warranty. Another hardware change that Apple added that I think is very useful is the ability for dual SIM support. It uses an eSIM as well as a physical SIM in North America, and this is coming via software update later this year. And it also gives your phone the option to be protected under Apple Care and have theft and loss covered because of the eSIM. If you're someone who travels a ton internationally, then this is something that's going to be very, very useful, so you don't have to keep switching your SIM back and forth. You can just have both SIMs, and it will actually answer on both lines based on which one it came from. In my case, I have a main line that I use for contacting friends and family, as well as data that is shared with the family, as well as a corporate line that I just use for data because my mom always yells at me for going over on data on the family line. So I think eSIM is something that I'm definitely excited to try out, hopefully when it comes to Canada. As for the screen, the iPhone XS has a 5.8-inch display, which is same as the one on the iPhone X, whereas the iPhone XS Max has a 6.5-inch display, both of which have over 3 million pixels and a PPI of 558. These are OLED panels, so you have the nice deep blacks, and there isn't anything too special to talk about this. The display is still very good, and I found iPhone displays to be always very color accurate, which is something that I really enjoy, but at the same time we're nice and vibrant. They're also bright enough to be able to work relatively well in most situations of sunlight, unless you're in LA like I am right now to film this video and it's extremely bright outside. But these screens are great, I have no complaints whatsoever. And I think when it comes to like overall screen size, it's gonna be something that you wanna try out when deciding between the iPhone XS Max and the iPhone X. I'm really having a tough time deciding because as much as I'm very used to the size of the iPhone X and the 5.8, watching a ton of YouTube videos, if you guys check my battery analytics on YouTube, this phone is just so nice when it comes to watching it edge to edge, but Of course, you do still have the big notch on the top, which is one of the bigger ones in the industry, and Apple will probably make it smaller next year. As for battery life, that was one of those things that I just really wanted Apple to improve this year on the iPhone XS and XS Max, because my iPhone X honestly just didn't have a battery that was good enough to kind of last an entire day. And after having the phone for a year, being someone who uses it quite heavily but nothing extreme or out of the ordinary, I actually charged my phone what Apple told me 700 times in less than a year, which just completely baffled my mind. So essentially I was charging my iPhone X about twice a day from 0 to 100 because I found most of the time I was draining it by about 2 p.m. The iPhone XS has a smaller battery in terms of milliamp hours, but because of the new processor being more efficient, you have an extra 30 minutes, which I think is just so disappointing. If this phone had a better battery, maybe an hour improvement or an hour and a half possibly, if they made it even a little bit thicker, I would have probably used this phone instead of the iPhone XS Max, but because I do need a good battery to last me an entire day, the iPhone XS Max has been the one that I've been using since it came out. On the XS Max side, you have a 1.5 hour boost from the iPhone X, and if you guys take a look at my screen on time, I was easily able to get more than 6 hours of screen on time on a full charge, which is just what I need. When it comes to charging methods, Apple didn't actually install any new hardware when it comes to wireless charging pieces, but this year there is a tighter coil design which allows it to be more sensitive to the wireless charging pads. You can kind of just put your phone and it's going to be more likely to detect it. And it also charges around 30 minutes faster wirelessly, which is good to see if you use it on an everyday basis, but in my case, I kind of just put my phone on the charging pad when I go to sleep, so it isn't really a big difference for me. One thing that I am kind of pissed at Apple about though is they didn't include a fast charger with this phone. You get a 5-watt charger with a phone that in this case costs almost $2,000 in Canada, and if you get the 512 gig model, even more, and you're charging it with a 5-watt adapter when this phone has ability to charge 50% in 30 minutes, which is amazing. I use it all the time because I do have a lot of MacBook chargers sitting around. And although a lot of people are going to argue that if you have the money to buy this phone at this price, you can spend the extra money to buy a charger, I don't really think that's the point. I feel like if you're already spending that much money on a phone that isn't exactly the biggest change this year, Apple at the very least could have just included a charger that takes advantage of one of its great features. As for software and performance updates, I kind of left this all the way to the end because this is kind of the typical things that you expect on every update of a device. It's really a given. And this year you've got the Apple A12 processor as expected, and Apple claims about a 15% improvement from the previous generation, which on everyday use is not noticeable whatsoever. Honestly, my phone from last year is just as fast as it was when it came out, and iOS 12 also helped that. And the GPU has a 50% improvement, which for gaming is going to be a significant boost. The main change actually comes in the neural engine and machine learning and stuff like that Apple is going to open to developers to take advantage of. But I think the best part of the Apple A12 chip is that it is 7 nanometers, which makes it more efficient. As for iOS 12, it's one of those years where I have been telling a lot of people to update because, as with anyone, even as a tech YouTuber myself, I don't really like updating my phone. I used to like to, but I found that in recent years, even with newest devices, updating the phone ended up bogging it down. It slowed it down, there was glitches, and especially on macOS, it has completely ruined my productivity in some cases because software just wasn't compatible. But iOS 12 has kind of focused on making everything more efficient and also doing a couple tune-ups here and there to bring new features that people have been wanting for so damn long. Stuff like a better notification center, which has stacked notifications now, and also some improvements to the animojis and also iMessage. For the most part, a lot of the features that have been added to the iOS 12 are ones that I don't really notice straight up, but are kind of on the back end. But I do really like the abilities for stacked notifications, and one thing that I would like to see, especially on the Plus model with the largest screen that Apple has ever put on a phone, is multitasking. If there's the ability to just split the screen, such as on the iPad, that would be a great thing to see, maybe in iOS 13 or iOS 14, 15, 16. I don't know how long Apple's gonna try to make us wait for that. So last year, for the first time, we saw dual speakers on the iPhones, which is something that I was so happy to see because I think every phone nowadays should just have dual speakers, and I'm kind of surprised that not every single phone has done that yet. The iPhones this year have an improved speaker with a stereo speaker setup, and the front-facing speaker is actually a little bit louder and more balanced out with the bottom, and it is also slightly louder and clearer as well. The upgrades are noticeable if you were to compare it directly with the iPhone X, but honestly nothing too crazy, and I think the speakers on the previous generation were perfectly fine. It's one of those things where if you're already going to be buying the new iPhone anyways for a better reason, it's nice that they've kind of done that anyways, but here's a quick sound test. So otherwise, I think we've covered everything of the iPhone XS and XS Max. I've been talking for a really long time now, and I hope it hasn't bored anyone, but I think this is a good phone. I mean, it's obviously a good phone. It's Apple's best phone right now. It's the best they've ever made, and I'm sure you've heard that a lot of times now. I think the iPhone XS Max really does show what Apple is capable of right now, with exception to a couple new features that we probably could have seen when it comes to improvements in maybe the front-facing camera, the secondary camera. But in terms of power, engineering, design, efficiency, I think Apple's done a very good job this year. Even though I've given this phone a very good review, I've got to say, of the 7 years that I've covered the iPhone, this is the one that I've been the least excited for. When it was announced, I honestly just looked at it. I was going to order it obviously and give it a try, but I wasn't like hyped up and excited for it, especially coming from the iPhone X. And I think that's where Apple could have done a better job of justifying to iPhone X users why they should possibly upgrade to the newest model. And I know the normal consumer doesn't upgrade their phones every year, but I felt like in the past years, for people who use their phone a ton or rely on it for work, there was much better reason to switch to a newer generation. Whereas this year, I felt like the changes on the iPhone in general were very minimal with exception to the camera, if that's something that really matters to you. If you're an iPhone 7 or 7 Plus user though and are finally ready to give up that home button, then I think you're really going to enjoy the experience on the iPhone XS or XS Max. In my case, I think the XS Max is going to be my daily driver because of the fact that it has a better battery, and I just feel like this phone having the screen going around the entire device, I just feel like I gotta use it. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it because I literally flew to LA with all my equipment and got this nice space and all that. I want to make this video a little bit different from all the other ones that I always make. So if you guys enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a like, and I'll see you all in the next one.